"You okay, sir?" the young waitress asked softly, refilling his coffee like it was just another table. But the veteran Shand froze. His eyes dropped not to Theckup, but to the single silver dog tag resting just above her apron. It swung slightly as she moved. One name, one date, and a blood type he remembered from the jungle, not a hospital. Because 54 years ago, he'd held the man who wore that tag as he took his final breath. Type never forgotten. If you understand, the diner was positioned just off Highway 41, tucked between a defunct gas station and a tire shop that had seen better decades. Faded tile floors, cracked vinyl booth seats in a vintage jukebox that hadn't produced music since the summertime round 2003. Frank Mallory, 75 years old, sat at his customary table beside the large front window overlooking the sparse morning traffic. He rarely initiated conversation with Agnon, just ordered black coffee, requested minimal interaction, and methodically read the local newspaper front page to classified advertisements of every single word, including the obituaries that seemed to grow longer each passing year. He had maintained this routine every Wednesday and Sunday since early 2015, following his wife Margaret's funeral. The servers changed with predictable frequency, but Theckafi remained consistently mediocre, lukewarm, bitter, probably sitting too long on the heating element. He drank it anyway without complaint. That particular morning brought a new waitress to the day shift. Early 20s, obviously inexperienced, but trying hard, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who didn't want to attract unwanted attention from customers or management. She approached his table with appropriate deference. "Good morning, sir. Coffee refill?" Frank nodded without looking up from the sports section. She poured carefully and offered a polite smile before continuing her rounds to other tables. He caught it peripherally at first, a silver dog tag hanging from a thin black cord mostly tucked beneath her uniform shirt, but briefly visible when she leaned forward to serve customers. The sight triggered something unexpected, a momentary flicker of recognition, a breath held involuntarily, but the sensation faded quickly, and had deliberately dismissed it as meaninglessness. The second time she approached his table, Frank made eye contact. "What's your name, miss?" She smiled genuinely. Jenna Khaled her. "That military identification tag, yours personally?" "Not exactly. Family thing." "Really? My uncle wore it during a service. I never actually met him, but me mom gave it to me." Frank nodded dacnulgent, returned attention to his newspaper, but his coffee remained untouched for the remainder of his visit. The rest of breakfast passed in distracted silence. The broken jukebox continued its futile clicking sounds. Newspaper pages crinkled under his increasingly unsteady fingers as memories he had carefully contained for decades began stirring without permission. He left payment under his empty cup significantly more than usual and walked toward the exit with noticeably slower, more deliberate steps than when he had entered. At home in a small ranch house, Frank retrieved a worn shoebox from the top shelf of his hallway closet. Inside, preserved with military precision, a faded color photograph showing 6 young men in jungle camouflage uniforms, weapons, anthers and stairs that belonged to soldiers who had seen too much. A carefully folded American flag presented at Margaret's memorial service, multi-pleservice ribbons and commendations had never displayed, and a matching military dog tag bearing the engraved indication Private First Class Liam Calder O positive blood type 1969. Frank held the metal tag filling its familiar weight in reading text he had memorized 54 years earlier. The memory had spent decades suppressing began flooding back with overwhelming clarity. Liam Calder had been barely 19 years old, fresh from basic training, couldn't grow proper facial hair, drew pictures of home in his spare time, and talked constantly about opening a restaurant when his service ended. Frank, 21, at the time, had naturally assumed the role of protective older brother for the Year 6-man reconnaissance team operating in hostile territory outside Dang. Neither of them had known that Liam would never see his 20th birthday or fulfill his dreams of cooking professionally. The dog tag felt heavier than it should have in Frank's weathered hands. Some ghosts don't haunt you with supernatural prints. They wait patiently for precisely the right moment to return and demand recognition for unfinished business. That night, Frank could not achieve meaningful sleep despite his usual medications and routine. He kept hearing sounds that belonged to Southeast Asian jungles, exotic bird calls, distant artillery explosions, helicopters approaching through humid air, and the specific sound of labored breathing through blood-filled lungs. Liam Calder had been the youngest member of their reconnaissance fire team, 19 years old, barely finished with military training, still learning proper shaving technique and writing letters home twice weekly. Frank, despite being only 2 years older, had naturally become Thetum's protective older brother figure and unofficial mentor for combat survival techniques. In November 1969, during a routine intelligence gathering mission outside Da Nang, their unit was ambushed by concealed enemy forces using heavy weapons and coordinated tactics. Liam took substantial shrapnel damage to his torso and abdomen during the initial attack. Frank had immediately dredged his wounded teammate into a defensive position, applied direct pressure to multiple bleeding wounds, and called desperately for medical evacuation while enemy fire continued in their position. Liam kept whispering through pain and blood loss, "Tell my sister. Tell her I wasn't scared when it happened." He died before their rescue helicopter could reach their compromised location. Frank had personally written a detailed letter to Liam's family describing his courage, his character, and his final words. The letter was returned weeks later marked address unknown. The next day, despite the emotional turmoil that prevented restful sleep, Frank returned to the diner with determination. He occupied the same table beside the window and waited. Jenny approached with coffee and her characteristic gentle smile. "Good morning again, sir. Your usual, please." Frank waited until she leaned over Topper. The dog tag slipped into view again, swinging slightly with her movement. He reached carefully, stopping her hand without grabbing. "May I examine that identification tag?" She looked confused, but nodded consent. Frank lifted the tag, gently turned it over, and read the engraved information with growing emotional intensity. "Liankled her o positive 1969. His voice cracked audibly. "You meant Ioneti was your uncle." Jenna nodded slowly, sensing something significant was happening. "My mother's younger brother killed in Vietnam when she was still in high school. We don't know many details about his service. She's never been comfortable discussing it." Frank carefully placed the tag back against their uniform, his hands visibly trembling. "He was with me," Frank whispered, "when he died." Jenna's eyes widened dramatically. She pulled out the opposite chair and sat down immediately, ignoring the service bell ringing at a third table. "What do you remember about him?" she asked with intense curiosity. "Everything," Frank said. "Hugh was terrified, but he still made jokes about pancakes and opening a restaurant. He specifically asked me to tell your mother he wasn't afraid during his final moments." Jenna reached across the table and placed her hand over his weathered fingers. "She needs to hear those words," she whispered with emotional conviction. Frank nodded, understanding that this unexpected encounter presented an opportunity to fulfill a promise he had been unable to keep for over 5 decades. If you've ever experienced the weight of unfinished promises to fallen comrades, type still with us below. An entire week passed without Jenna returning to her waitressing job at the dinner. Frank assumed she had quit, perhaps overwhelmed by their emotional congestion, or simply finding better employment elsewhere. But the following Sunday, she entered the establishment wearing her work uniform or carrying off service equipment, viewed accompanied by an older woman who moved with quiet dignity and carried herself with the bearing of someone who had endured significant loss. A woman in her late 60s with steel gray hair, stoic facial expressions, and eyes that reflected decades of careful maintained silence about painful memories. Frank immediately stood up from his customary table. "Mrs. Calder," she nodded acknowledgement. Without smiling, Jenna handed Frank a manila envelope with obvious reverence. "She wants to hear everything you remember, but she wants to see something first." Frank opened the envelope carefully. Inside, he discovered something that made his breath catch. A photocopy of the original letter he had written in 1969, still sealed, never opened by its intended recipient. The envelope bore multiple postal markings indicating it had been returned due to incorrect address information. No forwarding address available. I kept the original, Frank said quietly. Hope someday I find the correct address and deliver it properly. Mrs. Calder finally spoke, her voice carrying 5 decades of suppressed grief. Tell me truthfully, was he suffering when it happened? Frank considered his words carefully before responding with complete honesty. Yes, he was in physical pain, but he wasn't emotionally scared or desperate. He's specifically about you. He said to tell you he was proud to serve and proud to be your brother. Her eyes filled with tears she had apparently been holding back for decades. He really talked about pancakes? She asked suddenly, smiling through her emotional response. Frank chuckled with genuine warmth. Hewald stopped talking about them. Said if we survived our tour, he'd open a family restaurant. Said he'd name every menu item after Beatles songs and serve the best breakfast in whatever town he goes. The woman covered her mouth and wept openly for the first time since receiving official notification of her brother's death in 1969. They continued talking for over an hour, sharing memories and filling gaps in family history. Jenna listened without interrupting, absorbing information about an uncle she had never known, but whose memory had shaped her mother-centered adult life. When they prepared to leave, Frank reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something he had carried for 54 years, Liam's original dog tag, the matching set to the one Jenna wore. He placed it carefully in Jenna's open palm. He would want this returned to his family where it belongs. Jenna clutched the metal tag like a precious metal. Her mother reached out spontaneously and embraced Frank, her shoulders shaking with released emotion. Thank you for keeping his memory alive, she whispered. I thought a very own who knew him had forgotten. Frank returned the embrace with equal intensity. No one who served with him could ever forget Liam. He saved lives through his sacrifice, and his memory deserves honor. Mrs. Calder pulled back and looked directly into Frank's eyes. Would you be willing to visit this grave with us? I've never had any who knew who actually knew him. To share memories. Frank nodded immediately. It would be my privilege. As they walked toward the parking lot, Mrs. Calder turned back once. The letter you wrote. May I read it now? Frank handed her the original envelope he had preserved for decades. She opened it carefully and read his words from 1969, describing her brother's courage, his character, and his final thoughts about family. For the first time in over 50 years, Liam Calder's family knew exactly how he had lived and died, and that his memory had been preserved by someone who understood the true cost of their loss. The following Wednesday, Frank returned to the diner for his regular coffee and newspaper routine. Same table beside the window, same lukewarm coffee, same methodical reading pattern. Except no when Jenna approached his table. Cher filled his coffee before he cold breakfasted, and their brief exchange is scary. The warmth of shared understanding greater than polite stranger interaction. She wore both dog tags now. Liam a original military identification, and a new one custom made for herself. Jenna called her a negative blood type. She never removed them, treating both as sacred reminders of family connection across generations. Over the following weeks, other servers learned about Frank's military background and his connection to Jenna's family history. Local veterans began recognizing him and offering respectful acknowledgments. One morning, someone left an anonymous note at his table. You brought Samiona home after 50 years. Thank you for your service and your memory. A Yuma's malframe photograph appeared behind the cash register several weeks later with it, official announcement or ceremony. It showed 2 young soldiers in jungle camouflage uniforms. Frank and Liam, both grinning broadly with their helmets removed, arms around each other's shoulders in the casual third that develops between combat veterans. Beneath the photograph, someone had mounted a small breastplate. Never forgotten family. Legacy continues. Frank discovered he no longer needed the coffee as motivation for visiting the diner. He came for human connection and the comfort of being understood by people who appreciated the weight of military service and sacrifice. One afternoon, Jenna approached his table with unusual humility. "My mom's planning to plant a memorial tree for Uncle Liam at the veteran cemetery. Would you be willing to attend the ceremony?" Frank accepted immediately. On the appointed day, he joined Jenna's family for a simple but moving graveside service. When Jenna placed both dog tags at the base of the newly planted oak tree, Frank offered a formal military salute to honor his fallen teammate. Mrs. Calder spoke briefly about her brother's dreams and aspirations using information Frank had provided to give substance to memories that had remained incomplete for decades. "Liam wanted to open a restaurant and serve happiness along with food," she said. Through Frank's friendship and Jenna's dedication, his memory continues feeding people, just in ways he never expected. The ceremony concluded with Frank reading aloud the letter he had written in 1969, finally delivering words that had waited over half a century to reach their intended audience. As they walked back to their cars, Jenna thanked Frank for giving her family closure they had never expected to find. "You carried him with you all these years," she said. "Now, we can carry him forward." Frank nodded, understanding that his weekly visits to the diner had evolved from solitary routine into meaningful community connection. Some names are lost in the chaos of war. Others are preserved in the quiet dedication of those who refuse to forget. Memory can heal wounds that time alone cannot address, bridging generations through shared respect for service and sacrifice. Subscribe to Heart Stories, where every quiet act echoes through.